I'm doing well. How are you, Trip?
I'm, just enjoying lockdown day 129.
Has it been 129?
Yeah, the UK isn't, or at least Scotland isn't just like hitting the gas really fast to celebrate our freedom and liberty like the red states. So, um, like I got an email from church. They said we probably won't even have any gatherings until late August, early September, and it'd be late night contemplative ones, so we don't sing, and you'll be like separated.
Wow.
And I'm
Wow.
like, clearly you didn't ask some of my family members on Facebook. They've been proclaiming the love of Jesus in their church every week.
Well, they're safe because they don't need to be covered by a mask. They're covered by the blood, right?
Well, I guess so. I guess so. Not everyone has that type of relationship with the blood. But anyway, so tonight we will kick things off. You will give us a lecture, then we will discuss the content of the lecture, the reading and things this week, and then look forward to everyone interacting on the group. If you have questions, you can post them on the video in the group, or you can respond to the email, letting everyone know this is on the resource page. So, yeah. And with that, Adam, are you ready?
I'm ready. I'm
All
ready.
right,
Yeah.
let's do it.
Well, we are actually beginning this online reading group at an interesting historical moment. First, we're commemorating the 401st year that Africans have been to the United States. And this is significant because 400 is a key number because probably the most identifiable scripture that African American Christians have kind of connected with has been the Exodus story. And of course, after 400 years, there's freedom was happening from Pharaoh, and that story has been paradigmatic in understanding African Christianity. So last year, there were a lot of things commemorating 400 years, and we're in the 401st year. It also marks the 51st anniversary of the iconic text, Black Theology and Black Power. This text is generally understood to inaugurate Black theology as an academic discipline. Third, we're in the 7th year of the Black Lives Matter movement, right? 7 years ago. It started with the kind of murder, I should say, and acquittal of Trayvon Martin's killer, right? And then you had an upsurge with Mike Brown and now with George Floyd. And also, it's the 2nd year since the passing of James Cone. And without his strong voice, it's unclear where the discipline is really headed, right? So we're only 2 years out of the passing of James Cone. And for Cone to engage in the Black theological enterprise is to engage in a conversation that's centuries old. To be an effective student of the tradition, one must learn its interlocutors, its sources, its norms, as well as its exclusions, its silences, and its limitations. So for Cone, theology wasn't just faith, it was the critical side of faith. And I see this reading group and this course as an invitation to be a participant in this centuries-old conversation, seeing the theological tradition through the lens of Black experience. Now, Black theology began in the late 60s, but its reemergence public reemergence appeared in around 2008 during the presidential campaign of Barack Obama, right? This is when many of you probably have heard the term Black theologies. The media made use of Jeremiah Wright's sermonic statements about chickens coming home to roost and goddamn America. And from that became a highly visible but poorly framed discourse on Black theology, right? After Fox News, a lot of kind of mainstream ads, media outlets put that out in public, the public reaction to Wright was swift and intense. And despite adamant appeals to the biblical text, Wright was not heard as channeling biblical prophets of Isaiah, of Jeremiah, and of Ezekiel. He was regarded as anti-white, anti-American, and unchristian. But what was missed by pundits and commentators is that Wright's ability to upset, unsettle, and enrage American citizens, or citizens of American empire to be more specific, parallels the biblical prophets who indicted the ruling elites and called for liberation and a new way of being community. And this is the impulse of Black theology, okay? Or more specifically, a Black theology of liberation. And for those who are not specialists in the discipline, there are distinctions to be made between Black theology, Black church studies, Black religious thought, and Black religion, right? Just like for those of you who know process theology, there's a difference between process thought, process theology, process philosophy. Black theology is a heterodox discipline with multiple voices and many contestations and antagonisms within the discipline. There's no one Black theology. But for this course and this reading group, we're looking at Cone because he's the dominant and normative voice that actually gave structure to the discipline in its academic form. Like most modern theologies, Black theology emerged as a response to the problem of evil, right? And one of the reasons why there's so many different theologies emerging from the academy right now is because we all interpret this problem of evil very differently. These should be seen as entry points into this long, centuries-long conversation on theology. Different entry points. If you see evil as primarily a way we confront ontological sin and get pardoned through the atoning work of Christ, right? Your theology will look one way. If you see the primary evil as white supremacy or patriarchy, your theology will look very different, right? So depending on how you see what the primary evil is, will give great direction to how your theology is shaped. Also, what is the question of theology? I mean, there are so many different classic questions of theology when you enter into this ancient tradition. Some of the older questions or classic questions are about like the two natures of Christ. One of the early councils were about do Gentiles have to follow the law of Moses before they convert, right? If you lapse, do you have to be rebaptized? Does grace pardon one's sins? Not just pardon one's sins, I'm sorry, but prevent you from sinning again. So all of these are kind of older classic questions. Then you have the Enlightenment that in the age of reason that impacts theology and makes theology not just something that clerics do and bishops do, or people who are professionally religious, but the criteria became reason. Reason, is it reasonable? So what came under suspicion theologically was anything claim of supernaturalness, right? Like miracles. And they stripped theology or stripped the truth of the Christian tradition down to what can be kind of empirically verifiable or stands to reason. But this approach to theology struggled with something very important to Christians, the resurrection. How do you understand the resurrection just with the criteria of reasonableness, right? Skipping down to the 1960s, right? When you had a real crisis of authority, where you have all the people in the 2/3 world waking up, overthrowing colonialism and oppression, right? different voices started to erupt onto the theological theme and talk back to empire. And they started to look at theology in a different way. That theology doesn't just need to be accountable to the believing communities. It needs to be accountable to the poor, right? So instead of looking at things like sacraments and baptism, theology needs to be structured around social misery, or needs to be responsive to people's social misery and oppression. So the shift went from faith and the unbeliever to faith and the non-person, or the dehumanized. Because when the world is on fire, right, you want to put out the fire. You want theology to be an advocate for that. You're not as concerned about sacraments or baptism. And what a way to structure how this actually occurred is, if God loves us, why do we suffer, right? That became a dominant theological question. How can you make the Christian faith credible, right, in a situation of colonialism, of economic depression, of misery, of underdevelopment? And this question started to be asked throughout the world. Is Christianity really, do you have a God who loves us when we live in such squalor and misery? So as you had people of the 2/3 worlds waking up, they started seeing that the old rules of theology do not really apply to them. So they're looking for new rules, right? The old rules of theology seem just totally irrelevant. Kind of like, Aquinas had this type of question: can several angels be in the same place, right? Or how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, right? Well, when you have the foot of oppression on your neck, that's one of the last things that you're actually asking. You're asking something that, even to ask such a question as that, such a metaphysical, speculative question, you have to assume the person who asked that has a fed body, a rested body, a body that enjoys leisure. But if your body is dodging bullets, if you're in chronic fear of your safety, you're not asking that type of question. Highly speculative questions come from people who are achieving self-actualization. If I could go back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the highest pole being self-actualization. You're asking certain questions to the theological traditions at that point. But if you've been deprived of physiological needs, food, clothing, shelter, and needs for safety, job security, health care, things of that nature, then the question to the theological traditions becomes very different. Frantz Fanon, in Black Skin, White Masks, raises the question, "Oh, my body, make of me a man who always questions," right? Here he turns that idea of the kind of Cartesian dualism about being a mind who questions into, no, the question, there's a relationship between the mind and the body. If my body is being mistreated, my body is in pain and fear and anxiety, that's going to affect the way my mind is thinking and the way I'm interpreting the Christian tradition. Right? So for Cone, the central theological question becomes, what does it mean to be Black and Christian? That's not just a social question, that's a theological question. And we're going to talk about that probably more next week. But one of the things, just to kind of tease it a bit, is how do Black people conceive of themselves as human, right? That's what it means to be Black. Black is a certain conception of yourself as human. At the time, Black people referred to themselves as Negro, right? That's under Martin Luther King. We were Negroes. Then with Malcolm, the term Black came into being. And that's just not a semantic shift, that's a whole way of reconceptualizing your humanity, right? So to go from Negro to Black, conceive of yourself as human. became really, really important here. Secondly, right, what does it mean to be Christian? Now, most centuries of the theological conversation, the received tradition had a certain set agenda, right? And what theologians were doing were just arguing about clarifications or revisions of its past, right? So the conversation was fairly narrow. What Cone does about what does it mean to be Christian, he's questioning, like, what is the basis? What does it mean to be theological, right? He doesn't want to take the received agenda and actually just rearrange the deck chair. He wants to go to the heart of Christian identity, right? What is the identity of the faith? And for people who've been enslaved for 246 years, then in Jim Crow for another 100 years, right? To ask the question about what it means to be Christian was a really crucial question, because Christianity had not delivered on its promise. So he's not going to, so if from looking at it from the Black experience, you're not going to take the received tradition as some type of take it for granted. You're going to raise the question of Christian identity in a fresh way. Right? So this type of reframing of the Christian tradition comes from the question of theodicy, or struggling with moral evil, right? The traditional question of theology asks the question, how can a God who is all good and all powerful allow the existence of evil, right? If God is all good, God would not desire evil. God is all powerful, God can prevent evil. So why does evil exist? That's the classical question. Well, in the Black tradition, here's how that question was reframed. How could a God that's all good and all powerful, well, if God is all good, let me phrase it this way. If God is all good and if God is all powerful, why do Blacks live so lowly and whites do so well, right? If God is all good and all powerful, why do Blacks live so lowly and whites do so well? And Black Christian intellectuals from about the 18th and 19th century really wrestled deeply with that question. And some of the responses or answers that they gave were really fascinating, right? The most common ones were that our suffering is for a higher purpose, right? Either to give civilization, to be granted civilization, Western civilization they meant, to get Western education, to give it back to their brothers in Africa, the brothers and sisters in Africa, or to enjoy the benefits of Western culture, right? So you have all of these kind of brilliant Christian intellectuals of earlier centuries who are trying to wrestle because they were stuck in a framework of affirming God's goodness and God's power, but then trying to explain why whites seem to live such luxurious lives and Blacks live so wretchedly. And the only way they can make that consistent is to try to import some meaning, some higher meaning into the suffering, that there was something beneficial about slavery. There was something beneficial about Western education and what are integrating into this democracy, in quotes. And most of these Christian intellectuals, they did not question whether, well, they questioned whether whites had the right religion, right? But they thought that whites had the right religion, but the wrong practice, right? Like they believe right, they have the right God, but they just practice it wrong. So what the kind of strategy of Black thinkers at that time was to try to use Christianity for good purposes and not good, noble ends, instead of for evil purposes like their white oppressors did. So then you have this kind of break from that tradition with Elijah Muhammad and the tradition of the Nation of Islam, who were Muslims and took a very different look at this question, a very different take on this question. If God is all good and God is all powerful, why do blacks live so lowly and whites do so well, right? Or why aren't black folks free? They've been Christian for hundreds of years and they're still not free, right? And Elijah Muhammad looked at this question and said, oh, I got it. This question is really easy. Your premise is wrong. See, the idea that the Christian God is a good God, that's where you're making a mistake. The Christian God is your white slave master's God. It's not a good God. It's a slave-making deity. And because you're a Christian, and because you're in a religion that enslaved you and made you more docile, you'll never be free. So Elijah Muhammad started teaching that, and Malcolm X, who was a disciple of Elijah Muhammad, took that and amplified that to the Black community. And that amplification just rung throughout Black life in the 1960s. And Black folks didn't know how to handle it. Most people were scared to even talk to him about that type of thing. But it was the first time you have Black freedom fighters who are not just critiquing whites for being racist, they're critiquing religion. Before, the religion was never problematized. Elijah Muhammad was the first person to problematize Christianity, right? And connect it to a racial ethnicity in that way. And what Malcolm argued is that Christianity is actually a hindrance to Black liberation because it caused disunity among Blacks. Blacks love their white neighbors more than themselves, and it led to brainwashing and miseducation. So Malcolm pushed that message and said there is no saving power for African Americans within Christianity. Because you've been Christian for hundreds of years and you're still in the same relative position that you were that you got to this country. Right? So with Malcolm X, right, instead of Blacks being on trial in terms of trying to be judged by a Christian God about sinfulness, he put Christianity on trial, right? And said Christianity itself is the problem. It's a hindrance. It's an obstacle. It's not a liberating faith. So that became the idea that Christianity is a white man's religion. He said whites are doing all right with Christianity, but it's Blacks who are suffering. And he made that critique not just about African Americans, but for Black people throughout the world, right? Most of at the time now, when he's making this critique, he's not just, you have segregation in the United States, you have apartheid in South Africa, and you have neocolonialism all throughout the continent of Africa, right? So you have all this happening where wherever you see a Christian nation, you see Black people under the thumb of white Christians. So for him, that looked almost self-evident as very obvious, right? Now for Blacks who are caught up in Christianity and are really believing in Christianity, they found the critique to be shocking, terrifying, right? And there are a couple of responses you could have here. You could either kind of ignore Malcolm and accept the faith as it is. Hey, the faith somehow is meaningful for me personally, and I don't care what Malcolm says. Or you can reject out of hand what he says. He doesn't know what he's talking about. Or you can reject Christianity out of hand, right? Like he did. He said Christianity is a religion of the white man and accept Islam as Black people's religion. Or some actually rejected Christianity and went to African traditional religions, right? So either accept Christianity and go into a kind of a Black as it is, reject Christianity and come up with a new narrative that you find is more enabling. Or the third option you could have is to reconstruct the tradition, right? To say, Malcolm, I see truth in what you're saying, but I'm also empowered by certain elements of my tradition. And Black theology is the Reconstructionist response, right? Seeing the truth of what Malcolm did and trying to fuse it to the liberative aspects of King's interpretation of Christian faith, right? To see Christianity through a vision of faith that takes seriously the experiences and lens of the oppressed. So that's what Cohen's strategy was, to reread the gospel through the lens of God's solidarity with the poor, based on the Exodus narratives and the gospel narratives. And that made a lot of sense in the urgency of the 60s, right? You have cities going up in riots and rebellions. You have people breaking away from Christianity. You have a church that's kind of been ineffective and not part of the struggle for the most part. And to have a faith that really speaks to the urgency of engaging Christianity, right? Engaging the movement for justice at that moment was really important, right? And what the Exodus narrative really talked about, the materiality of Christian faith, right? That God's salvation is not just the afterlife, but physical in history, right? And that became like kind of a lens in which people entered into the struggle, right? And that's what the first kind of conceptualization of Black theology of liberation was. But there's also another tradition that was kind of underdeveloped and got really addressed later. And this is another widely quoted scripture, especially in 18th and 19th century Black Christianity. It comes from Psalms, Psalm 68:31. Princes shall come out of Egypt, and Ethiopia shall stretch forth her hand, right? Now that's a kind of a vague saying, but what that meant to a lot of African-American Christians, they focus on the tropes of Egypt and Ethiopia. Now for a people whose origins have been so denigrated that they came from animals, right? That they came from uncivilized cultures, to really see Africa as reflected in the biblical text was ennobling, empowering, and spoke of the beauty and grandeur of Black life. So they would take those tropes and really try to look for ancient Black civilizations, such as Kemet, or the Nile Valley civilizations of Nubia, Ethiopia, and Egypt. Okay. So there started to become a whole type of study of going into the pre-Christian origins of Black people in order to really talk about a noble starting point different from slavery. We weren't always slaves. Slave is the most recent experience in the Western world, right? But before we were slaves, we were kings and queens. We were noble people. And that tradition of scholarship came from looking at those type of biblical tropes and using some secular literature and trying to recover a positive sense of African culture. Okay. It also got applied to looking at Christian faith itself. Now, when I get into this type of discussion, and this is not necessarily part of Black liberation theology discourse per se, or it's a very underdeveloped part of this. But it's something that I would say that Black lay Christians are very much interested in, right? The idea of what is the Black presence in the Bible or the African presence in the Bible? And I'm always trying to be careful with this type of thing because I'm aware that identifying race within biblical literature is kind of anachronistic, right? Meaning that even if you say someone's Black, you know, it's not like they're African American, or it's not like they understood themselves or attribute significance to race, to their blackness or being a person of color the way we would in our contemporary culture. Right? The only way this project makes sense in a certain academic sense is it kind of undermines the deep Eurocentrism that has captured the imagination, or what Du Bois called the religion of whiteness, which he talks about he defines the religion of whiteness as the ownership of the earth forever and evermore. He goes on to state that it's the belief that every great soul that ever was a white man's soul. That every great thought that ever was a white man's thought. That every great deed in the world was a white man's deed, right? So to really go back and really trying to talk about Black presence or African presence within the biblical text, it's more to try to undermine whiteness as a kind of moral default in the imagination, right? And also to challenge the kind of 19th century idea of the table of nations being some type of accurate assessment of human species as a subgroup, dealing with the curse of Ham in Genesis 9, right? And all this gets into, what happens when you have Black Christian intellectuals is using that to reverse those type of classic ways of reading the text under the idea of chosenness. So again, looking at Black presence in the Bible is really to kind of get at, be subversive to whiteness as being a default position for all biblical characters or a moral norm. We know that biblical societies were pre-racialization. Race is only a concept that developed in the last 300, 400 years, right? The Bible is at least 2,000 years old, right? The 4,000 to 6,000, you don't have the idea that human beings were organized around language, religion, and more culture than they were around racial identification, right? So before I get into the ideas of race within the Bible, I want to make two caveats. And sometimes when you make so many caveats, the point you're making becomes not as powerful, but I just want to make these at the outset, just out of kind of to make this academically sound. Number one is when you identify something as African, doesn't equal Blackness, right? I think Africanness is a sounder way to talk about things because Africa is a geographic category. We don't know about Blackness. We can speculate and assume, but you're on some more solid ground. It's more easily demonstrable about the Africanness of characters, right? But on the other hand, if we use the idea of Blackness, which is a malleable definition, but in America, it's a one-drop rule, right? Meaning that if you have one drop of Black blood, you are Black, right? Or another way of thinking about that, if Jesus got on a Jim Crow train, would he be allowed to sit in the front or would he have to sit in the back, right? So where on the Jim Crow train would you fit? That's the American definition of race. Right? So that's how I want to kind of think about this when I don't want to try to replace everything white with everything Black because we know there's a whole spectrum of that. But in order to make things intelligible, right, to a kind of contemporary audience, we use these modern idioms to talk about that. And again, we're trying to undermine that. So there are a couple different trajectories of looking at kind of scholarship within the biblical world, or to kind of including Africa as a part of biblical community. One is the recovery of ancient Egypt, right? When we said Egypt, well, princes shall come from Egypt, and Ethiopia shall stretch forth her hands, right? The idea of ancient Egypt got taken off by Black scholars starting with the early kind of 19th century, well, probably 18th century, but more into the 19th century, and even up to the early 20th century. And they're starting to really, like, Black people started to attach their identity onto classical Egyptian culture. And one underdeveloped part of looking at Black theological traditions is looking at Judaism as kind of an eruption within ancient Egyptian thought, looking at the similarities between Isis and Horus and the Christ figures, and looking at the similar themes within Egyptian thought and early Judaism. Because at the time, Egypt was the superior civilization, the more powerful cultural group. And a lot of what Judaism was doing was responding to Egypt. Now, a lot of the literature is very esoteric literature, so you have to be really careful, but there is some solid but underdeveloped academic literature on this topic. But I just want to say that as a way of mentioning, looking at ancient Egypt, right, and trying to understand how both Judaism and Christianity unfold from a pre-existent African culture. Secondly, the African presence in the Bible, right? Like, who was Black, right? And this is also a work that was started by the scholar named Charles B. Cofer, who was probably like the James Cone of this kind of Black presence in the Bible. And when I go to churches, there are a lot of people who ask about this question, about who's Black in the Bible. Now, Black theologians themselves aren't as preoccupied by this question, but a lot of church folks are. So I learned to kind of talk about this. And there are a lot of people. I mean, depending on who you ask, let's say it this way. Right? You could go and pick out different characters in the Bible who may or may not be Black. But the real important thing is not so much the color for Black theologians. It's, are they liberating? Are they making liberating acts in the Bible? That's far more important to Black theologians than the actual phenotype of the character. Now, some people argue that everyone in the Bible, except the Philistines and the Greco-Romans, were Africans, right? Because if you take a people who've been in Egypt for 400 years, right, which is Africa, right, they come out, you're gonna have at least one drop of Black blood in you or African blood in you, right? So the second step is looking at, second tradition, I should say, will be one, is looking at ancient Egypt. Second, is looking at Black presence in the Bible, Black or African presence in the Bible, right? And many times it's concealed because when you look or read the biblical text, you don't have the term Africa, right? And scholars don't use that when talking about the biblical lands. They'll use terms like Near East, or Middle East, or the Levant. And these terms tend to conceal or de-Africanize, right, the biblical community. In the text itself, you'll see terms like Cush, or Put, Libya, or Seba, or Mizraim. I hope I'm pronouncing those all right. And sometimes even the Canaanites are seen as people of color in that way, right? So you'll see all these type of terms in the Bible, but you won't see Africa. So that also adds to the kind of concealment of the African presence in the Bible. In Wilmore's writing, African Beginnings, right, which was assigned in this reading group, he talks about the 3 visits of Christianity. And when people call Christianity a white man's religion, they're only talking about the second visit of Christianity. That is through neo-colonialism that started with the Portuguese and inaugurated the slave trade. And modern African countries are still impacted by that, even though they've had their political independence for almost 50 years for the most part. But what Wilmore wants to kind of mention is that we skip over the first visit of Christianity to Africa, which is talked about in the New Testament, right? When he talks about who were the first churches, well, The writer of the Gospel of Mark is alleged to have started the Coptic church in Egypt, right? The first Africans, and kind of to really, in the Christian story, right? You see them in Acts and Pentecost. You have people from Libya and Egypt. You have the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts as well. So you have Africa in the Bible since its inception, right? But it's not marked as so. The early church, in terms of Alexandria, was probably one of the most important centers of Christianity developing. You have Philo, the Jewish philosopher, Clement, the church father, Origen, the greatest biblical interpreter of the early period, Athanasius, the defender of Nicaea against Arius, right? Jesus is the same nature and the same substance. And you have the Alexandria Catechism, I'm tripping over this, catechetical schools, right? Which were the most important schools of that time, and monastic movements that emerged out of there, right? This is the early formation. Yet when you look at the religious iconography of these folks, they look like Hellenistic Greeks or Romans. You won't see them as Africans, right? In addition to that, Carthage is only second to Alexandria as a center of Christian thought during the early period. And its library is one of the largest in the world. Some of its most top important thinkers and church fathers were Tertullian, Cyprian, Augustine, right? And in addition to that, you have 3 African popes, Pope Victor, Pope Melchiades, and Galatius. Hope I'm saying that right? Like these are all in the first 5 centuries. And in addition to Egypt and Libya and Tunisia, right, you had Ethiopian Christianity and Nubian, which is in the Sudan, all in the early period. Right? So Africa was crucial. Before Rome became like the center of Christianity, which was a later development, you know, most of the more important intellectual centers that contributed to the doctrinal formation of Christianity happened in Africa. Right? Now, we have to skip or jump hundreds of years to basically the 15th century, right, to the Portuguese, to really talk about they really, as a response to the Crusades, were trying to go to Africa to spread the gospel to Black Moors, right, and started the slave trade. And that's where people mark that idea of Christianity actually becoming a European religion, right? Because after that, there was this type of spread and domination of both capitalism, Christianity, and Western Empire kind of forming this unholy alliance and taking over the world, right? But during the early period of Christianity, you had much more prominence of African civilizations and thought. Right? And then lastly, what Wilmore talks about is the third visit. You know, we had the second visit of Europe. We had the first visit of biblical figures, the second visit of Europeans. The third visit were Black Americans, right? He talked about the late 18th and early 19th century. And those were folks who came to the United States who actually became converted to Christianity. And just like that central theodicy about, they felt that the reason why they were captured and taken to the United States was to learn about religion, to learn about civilization. And they thought that it would be a beneficial good to bring that back to Africa. So many Black Americans went back and settled in Liberia and Sierra Leone in order to try to evangelize their heathen brothers and sisters. Right? And that division between the Americo-Africans And the indigenous African is still a sharp divide in Liberia today, resulting in a lot of civil wars and conflict because they didn't shed their Americanness and went back and settled in Africa. So those are the three divisions. But when we talk about, is Christianity a white man's religion, right? Not only do we have to actually settle for, look at how Christianity is being talked about as solidarity with the oppressed, but we also look at the early origins of the Christian church. And I'll stop right there. All right.
All right. That was awesome. So I'm excited because this week's the big question is if Christianity is a white man's religion. Now, I have to say that prior to reading everything and thinking it through, I was really worried the answer is like probably yes, but we might could help him out. And I think a lot of the readings connected with the history is really helpful because one of the things that was striking, and you emphasized it there at the end, that it's not until the Eurocentric experience of in Africa that you get this. I don't know what the right way of calling it, but like the whitewashing maybe of Africa's presence in the biblical narratives and in the life of the early church. And then in that third visit, when you have African Americans who've become Christian, you see the way what Willie Jennings talks about in his lecture that echoes this theme, the way whiteness is not just skin pigmentation, but an ideology. Absolutely. Right? So then you have African Americans coming back, having internalized whiteness ideology and religion, creating tensions in Africa. I wonder if, like, when you think of how that question is heard, and then the way a more kind of rich history encounters it, like, what are the most frequent responses or the ways it's triggering that could be helpful to us to pay attention to what was happening within us and then what happens in others when we ask that question, like, is Christianity a white man's religion?
Yeah, that's a good question. So when you say us, you talk about us white people, right?
Or just everyone in the class, because it can come from different directions. Not just we had people in the Facebook group already say, like, I joined this hoping maybe I could reclaim as an African American man my early relationship with the church, because they recognized a lot of the energy, right, that you had mentioned Elijah Muhammad brought to the fore.
Yeah.
And so I feel like that question can get at it in different ways. But yeah.
Right. Well, whiteness and blackness within Black theology are signifiers that don't just denote color or phenotype. They're really more symbolic of trying to talk about power and privilege and advantage and disadvantage, right? That's the first thing. So when James Cone specifically, and I'll use him specifically because different thinkers usually these kind of these racial metaphors differently. But when he talks about being Black, right, like he talks about it as a metaphor for talking about solidarity with the bottom. His first book is Black Theology, Black Power. And then he goes Black Theology, Liberation. Then he goes to Spirituals and Blues. Then he goes God of the Oppressed, right? So it's not Black God, it's God of the Oppressed. So Blackness is a way to try to talk about who God's solidarity lies with. Not because they are morally better, but because God tries to fix things from the bottom up, right? So when you hear about whiteness and blackness, right, we're not talking about necessarily the way people are born. We're talking about moral choice here, right? So what it should do is actually try to get you to reflect on what you identify with, right? What is your humanity wedded to? Is your humanity wedded to things that give you power and security, material things? Or is your humanity wedded to the movement for freedom and liberation among people who are hurting and people who are disadvantaged, right? That's what he's trying to get at with that. He just uses whiteness and blackness as ways to try to enter into that conversation.
I think some of that same tension comes up in that the difference that you emphasize, the way theology kind of prior to the multiplicity of different liberation theologies in the West, you had the audience as the non-believer or the believer, right? And so what is happening if the believer is set against the non-believer is you're using enlightenment reason and experience, science, biblical studies, and all these things to get the person to your side. So the atheist is on one side arguing, and then you got the Christian or the theist on the other side, and they're trying to get you to their side. And at that point, the level of discourse is marshaling data and facts and history text things to compel one to assert something is true or false. Mm-hmm. And then Cone contrasts that where the theological problem, and you laid this out, I think, rather beautifully in how even the question of theodicy is raised, but the problem is the non-person. Mm-hmm. If theology is birthed, not in like a, why do bad things happen to good people, but can you give an account of a good God in the face of unjust suffering? And that the actual sufferer gets to speak about this divine goodness. If the non-person's there, then all of a sudden the discourse changes. And anticipating some of what we read in Cone this week and what comes next week, I wonder if you might want to say something about how that impacts theology's methodology. Because when the non-person is the location, then you start to notice how theologians freak out with liberation theologies, right? Because they don't want to go, oh, no, what I really prefer is upper middle class Eurocentric theology. That's my favorite contextual theology, preferably ones that engage 19th century German idealism. That's what Tripp thinks. But no, but what they do is they go, no, that's not real theology, because it's not about belief and non-belief at this cognitive register. It's not about marshaling truths and facts and stuff to coerce belief. You're telling me theology is about this other thing, this more at the root. And Cone's like, yeah, kind of like how Moses went to Pharaoh, that stuff.
That's right.
It's like when you think of theological methodology and the language of faith, how does that tension or distinction help us think through maybe inherent resistance to acknowledge the experience of ourselves and of other people and our own suffering and the way reality impinges on our materiality?
That's a good question. I think the best way to answer that is to look at kind of the new paradigm that Martin Luther King brings in, right? At the time, the dominant Christian paradigm was probably put forth by Billy Graham, right? Throughout the South, he's actually doing all these Billy Graham crusades, these soul-saving things, and Christianity was seen as a way that your soul gets saved to God. So it's this kind of escape mechanism, right? And people were kind of puzzled of how can you be a Christian minister and go out and get march and break the law, right? And they didn't see that as a proper etiquette for a Christian minister, right? To defy the law and actually talk about, and that faith, if you were a Christian minister, you should be about saving souls. But the way King responded is that human beings are more than souls. They are bodies, they are minds. That Christianity is not just a relationship of the soul to God, but a relationship of the entire person to God, in a person who inhabits a certain context. So to be Christian had to do more with what one's soul does. It also had to do with, is your body being fed? Are you being treated? Do you have housing? Do you have clothing? And this is just simple Matthew 25, right? Like about that. And that's the type of paradigm, and this was interpreted as a paradigm for social justice and social action through King. So what Black theology does, it takes the kind of paradigmatic change that King makes, right? That breaks from the kind of evangelical idea of the soul's relationship to God and uses that as a paradigm for Christianity is more about the whole person in the community and not just the soul alone.
If only King had been in a situation where the government thought masking was a good idea, then all of a sudden he'd be very famous on Fox News for civil disobedience.
That's right. I guess they try to use that as a nonviolent protest. Well, they're not even nonviolent protests. Some people are violently protesting that.
Yeah, he wouldn't have been down with maskless white dudes with AR-15s, but but it's hard to say like why are you going to cause trouble with the government?
Right, and that has to do a lot about with anthropological assumptions about what are we as human beings, right? Are we really people for others, right? That are well-being, that we're mutually invested in each other, or do we see it as just my choice has no impact, right, on other people's choices and that type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
That itself is kind of a theoretical assumption at the heart of that as well.
Yeah. Could you say a bit about in Anthony Pinn's article, he talks about how Charles Long talks about this double creation, the first creation being one's own subjectivity, and that's a process every person existentially comes to. And then the double creation, the second creation, the kind of fictive truth or expressed by the oppressors, and how that frames thinking about Black religious experience.
Man, that's a great question. I didn't think you were going to ask that. What he's really talking about there is that he's getting that from Charles Long, right? Like in terms of that Black people are born, right, in Africa, free, autonomous, without like kind of superimposed suffering upon them. And then what happens during the Holocaust of African enslavement and the neo-colonial and segregated oppression is that you get remade in the languages of your oppressor, right? And this is not just a type of, a lot of times what happens, we kind of, we say Black folks liken their oppression to the enslavement of Hebrews in Egypt. But Hebrews had their culture intact, right? They were able to worship their own gods. They were able to be custodians of their own language and traditions. Black people didn't have that in the United States, right? People like Henry Highland Garnett and David Walker would say that the enslavement of African American peoples was more horrible than the Hebrew slaves, right? They would talk about the grotesque things that were done to them by violence and abuse. But also our traditions, we were severed for our traditions and remade in the tradition of others. So therefore we had to speak Pharaoh's language, eat Pharaoh's food, take Pharaoh's name, worship Pharaoh's God, right? So what he's talking about in there is the remaking, right? Is that we were remade in the languages of Western civilization, and we could never fully go back to our first creation, so we have to look for the new creation, right? And what's that new creation?
And one of the things that struck me about that, and Monica Coleman, who'll be joining the class in a couple of weeks, I remember us having a conversation, and in the offhand in a conversation, she said, "Well, it's not like if our ancestors showed up in the South in the time of slavery and sent a Moses and told us our God's name, we would have remembered it." Right? Because the slaves were taken from multiple different tribes and cultures, and then they're brought over and forced in. And so that whole activity of new creation, and she said it, and I'll bring it back up with her, but I just remember after it, that was where my study academically of African traditional religion, which I really enjoyed that class in graduate school, and then thinking about Black theology and everything became different. And it's important, I think, for wrestling with the question, like, is Christianity a white man's religion? Because yes, you can take a tradition and read it against itself, right? Like most postmodern ways of rendering text do that. And so the part of the work I find that what Cone is doing is that he's developed a hermeneutics of suspicion that is a Christocentric hermeneutics of suspicion that then the Eurocentric church finds out it's more pagan than the Black church. Right. Like it. And so like, it's like one of these like jujitsu moves, like all the energy of white supremacy is like jumping on you. And then like you grab their arm and roll, and all of a sudden they're pinned. That's like the movie, like you use its energy against you. And so Cone develops this hermeneutic of suspicion, like Marx, Nietzsche, Freud, all these kind of classical 19th century philosophers. But instead, he goes like, if you attend to the particular experience of Black life and the particular experience of God's covenanted people in Scripture, and the particular experience of the one we call Lord, then all of a sudden you go, oh, junk, we universalized the European subject. And that one particular expression became normative for everyone, and we've been enforcing it on people.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And Malcolm X is his hermeneutic of suspicion. I think that's what I think he introduces that in Malcolm and Martin. I think he refers to him that way. But what he really is trying to get at is just like Marx talks about economic interest, Freud talks about drive, but Malcolm talks about racial interest, right? And then that's where the whole idea that Christianity is in the racial interests of whites and in the disinterest of Blacks, that's his claim, right? So Black theology emerges out of trying to prove that wrong and trying to really say, and that's why solidarity with the poor, the oppressed becomes the defining feature, the normative move for understanding the substance of the gospel, right? He takes that from Exodus and reads the entire Bible through that lens. And that undermines what whiteness means. And let me also either say whiteness and Blackness too, because Cone was very clear that he's talking about North American Christianity, how these metaphors function within the North American kind of symbolic syntax. If we were in India, East India, he would say, no, we got to talk about the Dalai. They're the Blacks are there. We're in Palestine or Israel, modern state. We talk about the Palestinians. If we were in Korea, there would be a different kind of cast. So what he's trying to do is talk about a positionality. Blackness means multiple things. Most of the time when we talk about Blackness in the United States, we're talking about race. Well, Blackness is race and culture. And in theology, at least in Cone's rendering, it's mostly referring to positionality. So Blackness is talking about a position vis-a-vis advantaged people. So that's the way he's looking at becoming Black. And he invites whites to become Black, right? Using that kind of symbolism. It talks about John Brown as Black, as actually disinvesting in his identity with whiteness and joining Black folks. So that's the way that's being used in terms of that, as a way of trying to talk about the substance and the content of the gospel through this type of solidarity with poor and hurting people.
And I find there's two different elements of the offense of that, right? Like one is just the offense of like, I don't want to have my privilege questioned or whatever that can come up, or that type of thing. But I think the other element is the way in which so many people in the West, regardless of where they are in the power dynamics, are more comfortable with an abstracted deity from our material situation, right? And think of how many working class and poor people are parts of prosperity gospel churches. and are in there. Like underneath that is this that where there's an offense that the underside of our materiality at the present, though those who are most excluded and oppressed now are the very place God shows up, is offensive to any time an ideology that normalizes the kind of individualism, the economism, the desire for success by consumption and possession, right? And so that the taking of the words God and Christ and putting black there is a way of materializing it in a present, that material order gets covered over in theology if it's abstracted, right? And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, talk about wealth and prosperity, or talk about going to heaven, or there's all these different maneuvers. And one of the things that popped out about that, I think, in the Willie Jennings talk, and about can white people be saved, is the way in which whiteness shifts thinking spatially about place. The whole biocentric community you're a part of, multiple generations you're a part of, and the network of web of being that you're in, to thinking temporally. Whiteness gets you to think temporally. Where are you going then becomes the question as normative, be it to college so you get a degree so you can own a home in the right place, or to heaven. But all of those are promissory notes of possession, and not kind of like lenses by which you interpret the place that you're in with a kind of robust affirmation and connection.
Yeah, that's a real, that's interesting. I'm trying to think how to best kind of respond to that. When you talk about, so is your reaction, was that a question or was that like a comment in terms of just react to that?
It was more like a connection between the two things that was sitting there, and it was half connected to something you asked me before we ever started recording, like last week.
Oh, okay.
If you,
Yeah,
I can be really explicit if you want.
okay. Well, let me respond to this way. Part of what Cohen is trying to do here by looking at, we'll talk about this in actually the coming weeks as well. He's actually looking at what American theology ignores, right? How can you be an American theologian and miss slavery, right? Your German theologians don't miss the Holocaust, right? How can you not even discuss that as a theological problem, meaning that it challenges the credibility of the Christian message? How can you miss segregation as challenging the credibility of the Christian message, right? The Holocaust challenges the credibility of Christian faith in a way that slavery and segregation does not. So what he does, and you're right about a Christological thing, is that Cohen makes a distinction, or theologians make a distinction for people who are not familiar with theology, between the Christ of faith and the historical Jesus. So one of the way he makes this argument is that, look, you can have a theology, but to make it Christian has to have these specific characteristics, these features. And one of the most important features is this type of solidarity with the poor, right? And some of the things that we talked about before in terms of this moment, his latest is one of his last books, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, is really trying to remind us that if we have a criminalized, rejected body at the center of our faith, how can we miss the crucified and rejected bodies, the criminalized bodies in our culture today, i.e. George Floyd, i.e. all these Black men who are being beaten, right? That Cohen would have us try to make a connection between what's at the center of our faith and what's happening right in front of us. And the fact that we missed that, he would say, is due to whiteness as an epistemic condition, the way we interpret reality and miss things that are right in front of us, that we can't see our neighbor as human, right? And that's what he would say the distortion of whiteness is.
Mm-hmm. And I think in the Jennings piece, it's really helpful for kind of like making explicit what's happened in that contrast of white and black, and the origin story he gives it in that talk I find really fascinating. He talks about the way in which race emerges alongside private property, and that in a sense, we he says, like, we can't do separate but equal with humans, and we definitely can't do it with our non-human neighbors, right? So when we start to ask the problem of whiteness, this isn't just like a special interest group for religion where, you know, black people in America hope to get equal. What we're trying to tell you doing is, like, y'all like got an ideology going on, and if we let that keep running, we're going to kill the planet and kill anybody that doesn't cooperate with it. And in fact, it's going to end up killing you. So let me help you out.
Absolutely.
Right? Like, so, and I just think that's such a helpful way, because like he does for the question of race what a lot of ecofeminists do in the question of feminism, is to show that there is a toxic, hierarchical, patriarchal, normative power in the kind of abstracted account of being human in the West that leads to a series of divisions. And there's a whole host of them that we have, and they're very familiar. And then what you do in a division is you create a binary, and then you prioritize one over the other, and that boundary then gets policed in a problematic way, right? Like you could do something like appearance versus permanence, language versus reality, us versus them, agent versus tool, mind versus matter, self versus environment, a decision versus determinism, and thinking things through, or man and woman, human and non-human, conscious world, public, private. Like, you create these binaries, and then within the binaries, they get prioritized one over the other. And it's that that act of division, that cut, which then gives the ideology or the map to growth, right, that he highlights connected to whiteness. And so like thinking through the way in which whiteness bifurcates our nature and reality, and in doing so, the cut is a division of valuation, not a distinction for relation. And I think that's really important. Like, when you're making a distinction for relation, like I'm defining myself, Adam's defining himself, and that helps us be able to relate better as friends. That's one type of distinction. But when there's a bifurcation, it's a cut and it's a division, and then one gets valued differently than the other, then it creates the conditions of violence. And so Dr. Jennings talks about the way death began by cultivating a world in which you deny the voice of the earth and its peoples. So I was struck by it.
In Black theological discourse, a lot of times whiteness is used as a metaphor to talk about severed belonging, right? That you can't see the humanity of the other. And people will say, why did Black? Well, Blacks always saw the humanity of whites. Like, you don't have the same type, they're not moral equivalents, right? Like, this identity was forced upon us in a way where we've always seen, you don't have this type of idea of mass violence against white people, right? In terms of that. So it's it's a form of being alienated from the humanity of the others and severed belonging, where you see yourself as set apart from belonging to the entirety. And I think that's where Jennings and probably Cone agree upon in terms of how that's dangerous. So when they talk about critiques of whiteness as a false idol, right? They're really trying to say we need to mark that as a certain particularity, right? Just like one particularity among others, in order to really try to get at the whole, because now it's a default position, right? Just like what I was talking about in the Bible, that you don't have to even say the character is white, but if you represented in your head or in a text, people will naturally just assume unless you specifically say it's not white, right? In terms of that. So whiteness as a kind of moral default, it's what's being challenged here. Jennings talks about aesthetics precedes ethics, right? That we tend to treat things better when we see them as beautiful, right? So part of what's being reclaimed by all of these different types of theology is really trying to be more careful, more attentive to the aesthetic complexion of the faith, right? Because we tend to, once we start to value that equally, we tend to treat people who are seen in that image equally as well, sacred as well. And even people who may theoretically have a doctrine of equality, we know don't practice it, but part of like what we've talked about before is because this stuff gets in your nervous system, right? It's not just a head thing. It's about formation, right? So to getting at that is extremely difficult. And academic Black theology still is has a tendency to get caught up in the academic game, speaking to other academics. But when you talk about the kind of full spectrum of theology, or theology as a grassroots movement, like in the time of Cones, because initiated that, right? It was much more of a clergy movement and an academic movement, but it's kind of lost the grassroots, although with Black Lives Matter, there's a possibility it might get there, right? You have to talk about other things besides what's happening in different types of academic trends. You have to talk about the full formation of how human beings are able to make moral options and moral choices, right? So that's the hope here.
Mm-hmm. So the last question that I had thinking about the reading was a way in which a couple times authors mention what leads to the resistance of kind of taking Black theology and its observations seriously. And I wrote down a list of different reasons that came up across the different texts.
Mm-hmm.
Some will say the defensive posture is to minimize the legacy of white supremacy, or minimize the violence done in the past, right? So like we don't have to listen to Black theology that much, or we don't have to like take it so seriously, all these things, because we're going to minimize the violence. Others talk about the way you encounter people that exaggerate the goal, like what's been achieved, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you're like, well, yes, that makes sense, but look how far we've come, or that type of response.
Right.
Another is that people don't want to divide, because if we raise things in ways that are divisive, then you're going to lose the support you need. And there was all these different types of or others that the vision that comes out of a Black theology is one that it doesn't exist on the live options in the present. And you're like, yeah, probably not. But nonetheless, that gets used as kind of minimizing responses.
Absolutely.
I wonder what, like in your own encounters, like what are the ways different parts of the church resist listening, or what are the defense mechanisms that may be coming up for people if this is their first time reading through these texts that may be coming up that are important to just put on the table, and they've obviously decided to sit and read with them, but like what are those defense mechanisms, and how and what is it like to sit with the trouble of the fiery Black power voice that we get to read in, before our next session?
Yeah, translating Christianity through a Black power idiom, right?
Mm-hmm.
Language, yeah. I taught a group of white students who actually asked me the same thing, and it was funny because they actually they were living for a semester in. There were white kids from the suburbs who were living, doing this kind of intentional living situation in a Black community, in a Black urban community in Cincinnati, Ohio. So they told me how they were reading Black theology on a bus, and how people would look at the cover of their books and they would like get all nervous and freaked out. And I was like, wow, you got to imagine yourself like with the early Christian literature, like during the Roman period when you could be fried at the stake and that type of thing. Like it's got this type of like, but it really just their sense of being a minority. I would say, well, you know, that's an interesting type of flip. But one thing James Cone did, he wrote about that kind of anxiety, and he really he's talking to scholars, but I think it applies it to beyond scholarship. And he's really responding to the question, why don't white scholars of religion write or speak about racism? He gives 4 hypotheses. First, one, whites don't have to talk about racism because they don't have to talk about it. They have the power. The quality of white life is hardly ever affected by what blacks do or think. And the reverse is not the case. Everything whites thinks and do impacts black people at a daily basis profoundly. So blacks have to think about this, right? So secondly, white theologians avoid racial dialogue because talk about white supremacy arouses feelings of guilt, right? Whites don't think of themselves as evil people, or that their place in this world is due to colonialism, enslavement, the extermination of people of Native Americans. They see themselves as fair-minded and hardworking. So there's a resentment from being labeled as a thief, murderer, a slaveholder, a racist. And they say they don't owe anything to blacks. Like, I didn't personally enslave you or lynch you or segregate you. I treat everybody alike. Now, on an individual level, there's some truth to this observation. But if you benefit from the past and present injustice against blacks, you're partly and indirectly accountable as a citizen and a member of an institution that perpetuates racism, right? Like, you don't necessarily have to be the one that commits things. You could be a beneficiary of something. Oh, well, that doesn't make sense. Well, of course it does, because you benefit from a lot of things that you didn't personally do. Like you honor Civil War veterans, war heroes. You weren't personally in the war, but you benefit from what they do. So if you could do that on the positive side, the flattering side, America the Beautiful, right? It has to equally apply as America the Ugly as well. Right? You can't only embrace the good of America and reject the bad. Thirdly, he says, whites do not want to engage black rage, right? Whites do not mind talking as long as blacks don't get too emotional, too carried away, or too carried away with their stories of hurt, right? But Cone, what he does is he asks the whites to imaginatively enter into a world of black suffering, right? And we're going to talk about this probably next week or the week afterwards. Imagine being in a community that's 246 years of slavery and 100 years of lynching and segregation. Imagine if 1 million people, right, were incarcerated when you're only 12% of the population. Imagine 13% of the drug use, but 74% of the prison time for possession. Imagine if your sons and daughters were shot in the head by police because their color made them suspects. If that were the case, would you caution the oppressed of your community about speaking with patience and calmness, right? White Americans tend to identify more with Jewish suffering than black suffering. Right? Whites support Israel and built a huge Holocaust museum. At the time of this writing, they hadn't built a slavery museum or weren't forthcoming about reparations. Those things are really, antithetical to where most whites are politically. So he calls for a new solidarity centered around identification with experiences of pain and suffering. Fourth, whites don't speak about racial justice because they are not prepared for a radical redistribution of wealth. Fighting white supremacy means dismantling white privilege in society, churches, and theology. Progressive whites do not mind talking as long as it doesn't cost them much, as long as the structure of power remains intact, right? So Cone wants to say that part of being Christian, or maybe the fundamental thrust of being Christian, is to really make the case that it's immoral to see evil and not fight it, right? So part of that, his work was to develop an anti-racist theology that begins with anti-racial struggles. And you don't necessarily have to like go out and join the kind of protests that you see in the streets in downtown to be in an anti-racist struggle. You start where you are, your church, your seminary, your publishing house, your school. Start there. The other thing is to support Black empowerment in society, in churches and theologies. For white theologians, it's not enough to just condemn white theology, white supremacy, but you have to encourage voices of color, right? So those are some of the things, or some of the actions that Cone really talks about, that he makes an analysis of why the issue of race is not treated with the same type of fierceness that we get anti-Jewish stuff, and we get some patriarchy and sexism, and really suggest some remedies that actually can happen if you're concerned, and really says that if you claim Christianity, you're really obligated to do that, not just concerned, but obligated.
Mm-hmm. No, that's super helpful. And for everyone in the group, if you can think of other regular responses or anxieties that come up, feel free to share them. And remember, as you're doing the reading for the next week, if you have questions in advance, you can send them in. If not, you can always put them on there. We'll have a special session next, before the next deep dive, where we're reading quite a bit of James Cone. So prepare yourself. Anyway, last thought. Is there any advice you have if this is first time people are going to be sitting with, significant amount of James Cone? Advice on how you read him as a thinker?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Trip. I would say, just like I would say with anything, is you don't have to accept everything that any author says, right? But you want to be able to understand him on his own terms, right? So part of what we're going to try to do in this course is really try to make visible some of the movements in which James Cone was formed, which he emerged from, and really try to talk more about the Black experience. If you've never been to a Black church or don't know much about the Black experience, right, then I want you to be patient and take a deep dive so you can understand the lens in which he sees things. Part of Real Closely, and I'm going to walk people through this probably next week, is that one thing that whites don't realize, that Black people have been enslaved in this country longer than they've been free, right? The last legal barrier to total segregation happened in 1964, which was the Civil Rights Act, right? So America has only been a democracy for Black people for less than 50-something years, while whites called America a democracy for over 200 years, right? That's a very different thing. And even with the idea being this kind of relative democracy, we still have new Jim Crow segregation with the type of incarceration. So when you really immersed into a Black experience, you have to understand that you're talking to a people, or you're looking at a people who've been enslaved longer than they've been free. So therefore, the Christian narrative is interpreted very, very differently from that standpoint, right? And you should keep that in mind, and then look at how long Jesus' people were enslaved, right? And how they were interpreting things. And you'll see some structural similarities between the two.
All right.